I'm James Miranda.
And I'm Miranda Watson. We're the husband and wife writing team that created the military thriller Monroe Doctrine series and the military sci-fi series The Rise of the Republic.
We have some additional content we'd like to share with you guys today, and we hope you'll find it informative and entertaining. We're planning to create more videos similar to this in the future.
As always, please like, share, and subscribe. Now let's get started.
Chapter 16, Partisans. January 16th, 2021, near Bolton, Vermont, Camel's Hump State Park. Tony hid under a winter-colored camouflage blanket as he watched the latest convoy of military vehicles travel down I-89, past the small town of Bolton. He felt a slight shiver pass through his body as he fought against the cold temperatures and the biting wind. Within 12 hours of setting up his little position, he'd realized he was not adequately equipped for this. They always make sniper operations look so easy in the movies, he thought. When the invading UN army had captured his state a couple of days ago, Tony knew he had to do something to stop them, but he wasn't quite sure what. Then, when he'd heard on the news about the naval battle in the North Atlantic, and how the ship his older brother Paul had been on had been sunk, he'd been devastated. He had no way of knowing if Paul had survived or died because mail from the rest of the country wasn't making its way across enemy lines. The occupation authority sure as heck didn't know, and even if they had, they wouldn't have cared less. After brooding about the loss for a day, a plan on how to get the enemy back began to form. Tony was an avid Call of Duty player. It was a way he and his brother had continued to stay in touch and interact. They'd play online together whenever he was in port or had access to his online account. In the game, he'd always been a sniper. Not quite the same as real-life experience, obviously. But in real life, he did hunt and sport shoot with his older brother and friends. Even while attending college, he'd still found time to go hunting. Tony had talked to a couple of his college buddies, and they'd decided to take their hunting rifles and do something. That was 28 hours ago. Now, sitting under his winter camouflage blanket in the freezing cold, he was beginning to have his doubts. What in the world were we thinking? He wondered. "Tony, that convoy is getting closer. Are we going to shoot at this one?" asked one of his friends over their walkie-talkie. They had let the previous two convoys pass without firing a shot. The first convoy had a couple of tanks with it, and some other armored vehicles they had never seen before. The second convoy came through several hours before dawn, and they couldn't properly see the vehicles to really know what they were, so they waited for the sun to come up and figured they'd hit the next one they saw. Looking through his scope to find the vehicles traveling down the interstate, Tony spotted the new convoy. He grabbed the walkie-talkie, depressing the talk button. "Yeah, this looks like a good one. I don't see any tanks or other armored vehicles," he answered. "So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to shoot at the lead vehicle to try and kill the driver. You guys shoot at the drivers in the other vehicles. If we're lucky, the vehicles will lose control and it'll hurt or kill some of the soldiers in the back. The ones that do survive, we can snipe at when they get out." He paused for a second before he depressed the talk button to add one more thing. "Let's fire off 3 or 4 shots and then run back into the woods, okay?" With their impromptu plan decided on, he returned his gaze to his scope to find the lead vehicle. He sighted in on the driver's side front windshield and saw the silhouette of the man he was about to kill. "This is for you, Paul," he whispered. He flicked the safety off his rifle, let out a breath, and squeezed the trigger. Bang! The shot rang out, but Tony stayed focused, waiting to see if his bullet had hit his mark. In the flash of a second, he saw a splash of red appear on the windshield of the vehicle, which swerved into one of the guardrails on the side of the highway. He immediately pulled the bolt back, ejecting the spent round as a new one slammed back in its place. He looked through the scope again. Soldiers jumped out of the back of the disabled vehicle. They had their rifles raised but seemed to have no idea where the sniper fire had come from. As Tony was aiming at another soldier, he heard several loud cracks as his two friends also fired at the soldiers. Tony aimed at one soldier who was shooting in their direction. He placed his red dot on the man's chest and fired. Bang! He saw the man drop like a switch had been turned off. Quickly now, he worked the bolt, ejecting the spent round and preparing to fire again. Now, the enemy fire was getting closer to their position. He heard some bullets whizzing over his head. A few rounds hit the dirt and rocks in front of him, causing him to flinch a bit. Steeling himself, he took aim at another soldier and fired one more time. His third shot missed. "Tony, we need to get out of here," one of his friends shouted in a terrified voice. Now he heard the rhythmic thumping of a helicopter's rotor blades approaching. Panicking, Tony jumped up, grabbed his camouflage blanket, and ran like the wind back into the woods. The sound of the approaching chopper continued to get louder and closer. Minutes later, chunks of dirt, tree branches, and rocks were kicked up all around him as the gunner from the yet unseen helicopter shot at him. Diving for cover behind a tree, Tony hoped he'd be able to elude the chopper that had been sent to hunt them down. He turned and saw one of his friends running toward him, panic and fear written all over his face. Then, in the blink of an eye, his friend practically disintegrated before his eyes as he was torn apart by the large-caliber machine gun in the sky. In anger, Tony aimed his rifle at the helicopter, which had to be no more than 500 yards away. He fired a round, certain he had hit his target, only to see the flying Grim Reaper turn toward him. Before his mind had even time to register what had happened, he saw something fly out from under the helicopter's wing pylons toward him. Then, everything went black. Detroit, Michigan. Chief Warrant Officer Trent Punisher Lipton of the 1st Battalion 5th Special Forces Group had just crawled out of the manhole cover in the center of the now dark and empty street. He looked around him with his weapon at the ready position. The snow was still falling rather steadily, which aided in covering his exit, but also made it harder for him to ensure the area was clear of roving patrols. He did a quick 360 to make sure the coast was clear, doing his best to look for things out of the ordinary and listen for any voices or sounds that didn't belong there. The only thing he heard was the steady stream of truck traffic moving across the bridge not far away. When he saw no visible threats, he looked down into the sewer from which he had just emerged and signaled that it was clear to exit. A few minutes later, the rest of his 6-man team emerged and dashed to the now-abandoned Great American Truck Driving Building on West 4th Street, roughly 20 feet away. The team had just spent the last 6 hours crawling around the city's sewers, placing an ungodly amount of C4 near the support structures of the Ambassador Bridge. The busy suspension bridge, which had been a fixture since 1929, was the key link between Canada and the United States across the Detroit River, and it was vital to keeping the UN forces supplied as they continued their advance into Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio. They had managed to accomplish their task despite the roving patrols of enemy soldiers who were intent on preventing someone from doing exactly what they'd done. When the 1st Cavalry Division had been forced to withdraw from the city, several Special Forces units had stayed behind to try and wreak as much havoc with the enemy logistics and rearguard forces as possible. Lipton's team had been assigned the difficult task of trying to drop the critical bridge. The Air Force had already tried to bomb it twice and had failed on both accounts. During the first attempt, a bomb had hit the span, but it hadn't destroyed it. The enemy had merely placed a patch over the hole in the center of the roadway and continued to use it. When the UN force had realized how close they'd come to losing the critical piece of infrastructure, they'd placed a significant number of air defense assets near it. Those additional SAMs and missile interceptors had enabled them to stop the Air Force's second attempt at destroying the bridge. Since the Air Force was already stretched thin, they didn't have the resources to effectively complete the mission, so the task had fallen to Special Forces. Once Chief Lipton's team had successfully scurried into the defunct trucking company building, they did a quick assessment of the situation. Looking at his map, Lipton announced, "We still need to travel at least 2 more blocks before we can detonate the explosives and be sure to escape." This whole area is crawling with roving patrols," muttered Tiny, one of his soldiers. Lipton grunted. He wasn't wrong. The fact that they hadn't been discovered yet was only due to their training in stealthy movement and good teamwork. "I want us to move through this field here and try to make our way down to this pallet and packaging facility just off of Fort Street, on Vinewood Street here," Lipton announced. He pointed to the path he wanted them to travel on the map. His soldiers looked at the path. Hawkeye crossed his arms. "Sir, that's a lot of relatively open area to cross, with little in the way of tree cover and daylight about to break." Another soldier, Ski, nodded. "Yeah, it doesn't help that it looks like the snow is starting to let up. Our tracks are going to show up pretty easily in the fresh snow." Lipton thought about that. They were right, of course, but they also couldn't stay in their current location. They needed to get some distance between them and the bridge so they could blow their charges. The longer they left the charges in place, the better the chances were they'd be discovered by one of the roving patrols before they could detonate them. "I know it's not ideal, guys, but we need to move. We can't stay here," Lipton explained. He paused for a second before looking at their resident sniper. "Shorty, I want you to cover our rear. Do your best to brush over our tracks. Crispy, you take point. Try to find us some cover when you can, but move us quickly to our next rally point. We need to blow this bridge before our charges are discovered." With the decision made, the group moved as a unit to the rear of the building. After doing a quick search of the area, Crispy, their point man, quietly announced, "I think we're clear." He opened the door slowly and stepped out into the parking lot behind the building. The snow was still falling, but not nearly as heavily as it had been while they had been placing their explosives. Advancing cautiously through the couple of inches of fresh powder, Crispy kept his rifle at the ready, continually scanning the area as he did his best to dart from the back of the building to a pile of snow at the end of the parking lot. When he reached the mound of plowed snow, he crawled up the top of it and checked his surroundings. Seeing that the coast was clear, he waved for the others to follow him. 4 of them dashed to his position, while Shorty, their sniper, walked backwards slowly, using a piece of burlap to brush over their tracks. While Shorty did his best to cover their rear, Crispy moved from the back of the parking lot down the side of West Jefferson Street toward the railroad tracks. When he reached what he thought was a defensible position, he stopped and did another quick scan of the area. He signaled for the others to follow him again, and Shorty once again did what he could to try to cover their tracks. It took them close to 10 minutes to travel the 2 blocks. Fortunately, they hadn't spotted a roving patrol, although they did hear at least 2 vehicles drive past their previous position along Fort Street. When they reached the pallet packaging plant, they moved inside and searched the building, making sure it was clear. Then they identified possible egress routes should they need to hastily escape the building. "Okay, Punisher, I think we're reasonably safe in this location, at least for the time being," said Shorty. "I suggest we blow the charges now. It'll cause all the roving patrols nearby to rush to the area, so I also suggest we try to find a nice dark closet or room to hide out in." Crispy nodded. "I concur with Shorty. But I have a better hiding place. I found a staircase that leads to a small storage room on the roof. I suggest we place a few of our mini cameras down here to keep an eye on the place and relocate up there. We can lock the door, so if a patrol comes to the building and wants to search it, they'll see the door's locked and hopefully think it was left locked by the previous owners before they bugged out. Nice find, Crispy, replied Lipton. Let's do it. Go ahead and get the cameras set up. We'll see if we can operate out of this locale for a few days. The team immediately went to work on getting their remote cameras set up. It was vital that they know what was going on both inside and outside the building if they were going to make it a temporary home. God only knew how long they'd have to try and hide out in the city before help arrived, or they were ordered to try and evac out. Once they had everything in order, they went up to the roof to admire their handiwork. It was now 0530 hours, still another hour or so of darkness left. At that point, the snow had mostly tapered off, giving them a good view of the bridge. Pulling the remote detonator out of his pocket, Crispy turned it on. The red light activated, letting him know it was ready. He lifted the safety lever on the button up, then depressed the detonator with his thumb. Boom! A series of explosions ripped through West 4th Street at the base of two of the support structures for the bridge. The blast shook the ground like an earthquake. Chunks of road, rebar, and cement flew hundreds of feet into the air throughout a several 100-foot perimeter around the blast site. In a fraction of a second, a 12-foot section of the bridge collapsed to the street below, crushing several abandoned cars and blocking the road beneath it. Looking at the mess they had created, the ODA team smiled, knowing that they had just dealt a critical blow to the UN force invading their country. Northwest of Muncie, Indiana. First Lieutenant Trey Reagan looked through the sight extension of his commander's scope as he scanned the area for signs of Russian armor. His platoon, which was part of the 155th Armored Brigade Combat Team, had been directed to head to a small area called Reed Station, near I-69. The surrounding area was relatively flat farmland, intermixed with a few small copses of barren trees. It was ideal tank country, and their battalion had determined that they'd make a stand in this area. Their reconnaissance unit had spotted a Russian column of tanks and armored personnel carriers driving down the interstate toward the small Indiana town of Anderson 20 minutes ago. Unfortunately, their recon's communications equipment was being jammed by the Russians, so their unit had been unable to get an idea of how large the enemy force was, or what type of armor they were facing. With only a company of tanks and another company of light infantry in the area, their company commander had deployed a platoon of tanks to either side of the interstate, intermixed with their infantry brothers, who would bring their own anti-tank guided missiles to the fray for added punch. "Spotted them!" Sergeant Miller shouted out. Miller was his new gunner. He'd just been promoted to Sergeant E5 a couple of months ago. "Crap, Miller. Call out what you see and where," Lieutenant Reagan shot back. He was a bit angered by the vagueness of the report. "Sorry, sir. I got a little excited. It's a T-90, 9 o'clock, 4,000 meters. The crew was nervous. This was the first time any of them had seen any combat or faced an enemy tank. The last time the battalion had deployed was 3 years earlier, and that was to Kuwait. They hadn't seen any enemy tanks or been shot at during that deployment, so they were eager to engage the Russians, as well as nervous at facing a real enemy. Once Reagan spotted the enemy tanks, he responded, "Got it. Load Sabo." Sure enough, a column of tanks started to appear from around the bend in the interstate. 2 BMP-3s were in the lead, followed by at least 5 tanks, and then 8 BTR armored personnel carriers, and more tanks following behind them. There had to be at least 2 companies' worth of enemy vehicles heading toward their position, and that was just what they could see. Reagan wanted to get his report in before they began their attack. He depressed the talk button on his radio. "Dixie 6, this is Dixie 2-6. I've spotted an enemy column heading toward our position. They're just now passing through 4,000 meters. I count at least 22 armored vehicles, 5 T-90s in the lead, with another 5 pulling up the rear. There may be additional vehicles further back behind the bend. How copy?" A second later, the SyncGAR radio beeped, letting them know their encrypted radio had synced. "Dixie 2-6, that's a good copy," replied his company commander. "I want you to wait to engage the enemy vehicles until the last vehicle in the column is no more than 3,000 meters. Have your infantry engage the rear guard with their javelins. I want you to take out the tanks first, then work your way down to the BMPs before you engage the BTRs. How copy?" "Good copy. Stand by for contact," Reagan responded. The column of vehicles continued to get closer, moving deeper into their trap. Reagan switched over to the platoon net and the comms their infantry counterparts were using, and he relayed the plan to them, making sure everyone was on the same page. The next 5 minutes moved at warp speed and slow motion all at the same time. It felt like an eternity waiting for the enemy vehicles to get within range. At the same time, it felt like the BMPs and tanks were starting to get too close, and they worried they would spot them. "Firing now!" shouted one of the infantry officers over the platoon net. Looking through his commander's scope, Reagan saw 4 javelins fly out from their hidden position in the woods and head straight for the rear vehicles in the column. Depressing the talk button, Reagan shouted, "Engage!" to his tankers. Boom! The gunner fired their cannon. The tank rocked back on its track. The spent aft casing dropped to the floor, and the loader hit the ammo locker door button with his knee. He reached in and grabbed another Sabo round and slammed it home, hitting the locking arm into place before yelling, "Sabo up! Identified. Tank, 1,500 meters to our 9 o'clock," replied Sergeant Miller as he found them their next target. "Fire!" shouted Reagan. Miller fired the gun for a second time in less than 10 seconds. Boom! Looking through his scope, Reagan saw the round fly flat and true as it slammed into the front armor of the BMP-3. It ripped right through the armored vehicle, causing a massive secondary explosion. "Keep firing!" Reagan exclaimed, giving his team the go-ahead to keep finding targets without him. He needed to try and make sure the rest of the platoon was engaging their targets and try to keep track of what was happening around them. Zooming out and away from the target Miller was tracking next, Reagan saw his platoon had already blown all the tanks up and were making short work of the rest of the enemy's armored column. The few vehicles that hadn't been blown up yet were both popping smoke grenades to try and blur their vision, or at least mitigate the threat from the javelins, while the remaining Russian vehicles did everything they could to get off the interstate and seek better cover from his tanks. Bam! Suddenly their tank was jarred hard, nearly throwing Reagan from his commander's chair. His arms flailed about to grab for anything that could prevent him from falling. "Tank to our 3 o'clock, 1,200 meters, firing," came the quick and calm voice of Sergeant Miller. He was clearly now in the automated zone a soldier gets into when his training takes over and he just reacts mechanically to the situations happening around him. As soon as Reagan was able to get back into his seat, he immediately turned his commander's sight extension to where Miller had found the enemy tank. He caught a quick glimpse of it just before the turret of the tank was entirely blown off by Miller's shot. Bam! Their tank was suddenly plastered with rocks, dirt, and other debris from a nearby explosion. "Find out where that other column of tanks is coming from," Reagan shouted over the platoon net as he sought to figure out where this new threat had materialized from. "We've got another column of enemy vehicles moving down McGalliard Road. They're approaching from the east right now," came a voice from one of the infantry soldiers assigned to help protect them. Crap. How did another group of tanks and vehicles sneak up on us? Thought Reagan, trying not to panic. "Blue 3 is down," announced another one of his tankers over the platoon net. "I count 10 enemy tanks heading toward us, 1,100 meters, yelled Miller. He quickly fired the cannon one more time. "Back us up to the next firing position," Reagan yelled to their driver. Their tank lurched backwards, just as an enemy round impacted right where they had just been, exploding harmlessly in front of them. "Damn, that was close," realized Reagan, his palms now sweating. "Pop the smoke," he ordered. His driver deftly moved them backwards and then turned them to the left, making sure he didn't give the enemy tankers a good side shot at them. With the smoke grenades out, the area around them was steadily filling up with infrared inhibiting smoke. Another tank round hit a tree or something near them, showering their armored cocoon with more debris and shrapnel. "Tank to our 1 o'clock," yelled Reagan to his gunner as the tank he'd spotted stopped briefly and appeared to be aiming right for them. A split second later, the Russian tank belched fire and Reagan flinched, expecting the round to hit them. Instead, it sailed near them and slammed into one of the Stryker vehicles next to them. The explosion of the vehicle next to them still jarred their tank, and they were slapped with flame and more shrapnel. "Firing!" yelled Miller. The tank rocketed back from the recoil of their main gun. "Dixie 2-6, pull your force back to Rally Point Bravo. You're about to be flanked," came an urgent call from their company commander. "Good copy. Falling back to Rally Point Bravo," Reagan replied. He promptly relayed the order to his remaining tanks and infantry soldiers. The next 5 minutes were a desperate struggle as Reagan and his platoon of tanks and Strykers did their best to try and disengage from the enemy and fall back to the next line of defense. As they passed through the next 2 platoons worth of tanks and Stryker vehicles, about 2 miles to their rear, Reagan saw he'd lost 2 of his 4 tanks and 3 of his 4 Stryker vehicles. The rest of the day was mostly spent exchanging shots with the enemy tanks as they continued a fighting retreat to the outskirts of Anderson, where the rest of the battalion had rallied up and was waiting for them to arrive. They were now less than 10 miles from Indianapolis. By the end of the day, First Lieutenant Reagan was the senior officer left alive in his company, and had effectively taken command of what was left of their mauled unit. As they began their humiliating retreat around Indianapolis, he vowed he'd get his revenge on the enemy for killing so many of his comrades. Chapter 17. Desperate Plea. January 16th, 2021. Ottawa, Canada. Lord Elgin Hotel. President-elect Marshal Tate's office. Marshal sat in the kitchen of his makeshift home in the Lord Elgin Hotel, reading over the latest intelligence summary that had been put together for him by his national security team. What he read was sickening. The country he had sought to lead, to become president of, was being torn apart. Will there even be a country to lead after all of this is said and done? He wondered. Paige Larson, his national security advisor, interrupted his train of thought. The Ambassador Bridge connecting Detroit and Windsor is still temporarily down. We've had to move all vehicle traffic across the Detroit River to pontoon bridges. It slows us up for about a day, but the logistics train is back up and running again. General Mackenzie interrupted. The bigger challenge we have right now is dealing with the loss of our airfields. Paige Larson grunted. She didn't like being interrupted, but then again, she was glad to see the general above ground. Mackenzie had finally emerged from his own bunker complex once he'd felt it was reasonably safe to do so. He still didn't stay in one place for too long for fear of an airstrike, but he did feel secure enough to visit Senator Tate. Mackenzie continued. We anticipated the Pentagon attacking our airfields, but I'll be frank, I didn't think the acting president would have ordered such a brutal and thoroughly destructive aerial attack on my country as he has. We don't have a single military airport left in operation in the entire country. Once we relocated some of our military assets to the civilian airports, the Americans went after them as well. Heck, Even our ports that aren't frozen over are completely destroyed. Sir, we're going to run into a serious problem in a few more weeks if we aren't able to get resupplied from Europe, Russia, or China. I think your attack on Camp David and then that airstrike on Raven Rock turned the American population decidedly against us," Marshall said pointedly. "Couldn't you guys have done something a little less provocative?" He was still pissed that the UN had unilaterally decided to go after Sachs. The brutal attack on Camp David and the subsequent attack on Raven Rock and the capital had soured any political support he had in Washington and across much of the country. Chafing at the comment, Guy explained. It was a military decision. We had an opportunity to cut the head of the snake off, and we took it. We seriously hurt the Pentagon leadership and the military apparatus with that strike. We killed the Secretary of Defense, along with many other senior generals, so it wasn't a complete loss. Marshal Tate shook his head in frustration. "This is spiraling out of control faster than we can handle it," he thought. Marshall looked back and forth between his Secretary of Defense, Admiral Hill, and General Mackenzie. "Can we still win this conflict?" he asked. "Can we still remove the Vice President from office now that he has taken over, or are we done for?" There was a short pause for a few seconds before they said anything. Mackenzie spoke first. "It depends. We have enough fuel, food, and munitions for at least 3 or 4 weeks of hard fighting. But if we can't thin out the American air forces, they're going to pick us apart. The Russian and Chinese surface-to-air missile systems are effective, but we only have a limited number of them. We're also going to run out of missiles at some point if we can't get a resupply." Marshall let out a breath in a huff. "The battle in the Atlantic was supposed to break the blockade. What happened?" Letting out a sigh, Mackenzie looked at Admiral Hill for support. Hill nodded and proceeded to answer the question as best he could. "First off, you must understand this was a long-shot attempt, trying to break through the blockade. Our goal was to bloody the U.S. Navy up and convince them that the cost of stopping the convoys would be too high." Interrupting him, Marshall retorted, "Well, that clearly didn't work. I read the German summary, and it sounds like it was a turkey shoot, a horrific military loss for us." Admiral Hill grimaced at the comment. "It wasn't an entirely one-sided affair. I've read the German report as well. They primarily focused on the UN naval losses and didn't expound upon the losses we inflicted on the U.S. Navy. The Germans lost 3 of their submarines in the engagement, but they also sank 3 Arleigh Burke destroyers and managed to hit the carrier Lincoln with a torpedo." "Yeah, but they failed to sink the Lincoln," Marshall responded. "It's still combat effective, at least that's what the report said." Admiral Hill shook his head. "That's not entirely true. The ship did take a hit, and while it was still able to launch its strike fighters, the carrier is going to have to go to the shipyards for repairs. That means the ship will be out of commission for several months, maybe longer, depending on how bad the damage is. That, Mr. President-elect, is a huge victory for us. It means the Navy only has 2 operational carriers in the Atlantic, and that is going to make it easier for our supply ships to slip past the blockade. The Russians managed to sink 2 Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruisers and 3 additional Arleigh Burke destroyers for a loss of 9 subs. They also managed to sink 4 American submarines in exchange for 5 of their own. These losses are going to hurt the U.S.'s ability to run an effective blockade of Canada. We'll be able to start slipping more supply ships through as the Russian and EU navies continue to hunt down the Americans' remaining submarines and surface ships." Growing frustrated with the losses, Marshall shot back, "Let's not forget, Admiral Hill, that when this conflict is over with, this Navy we're talking about hunting and destroying is the same force we'll be in charge of. This is our military force we're currently destroying, along with men and women who we'll be demanding loyalty from when I'm sworn in as president." Admiral Hill paused. He looked out the window briefly, deep in thought, before turning back to face Marshall. "I agree, and you're right, sir. I don't want to kill them or sink our ships any more than you do. We're going to need a military and navy when you become president. But let's not forget that these men and women have also picked a side. They chose Saxe over you. When this is all said and done and we've won, and you are our president, we'll rebuild." The group sat there in silence for a moment before Mackenzie cleared his throat. "Mr. President-elect, I'd like to discuss the ground operations," he said. Marshall looked at Mackenzie and nodded for him to proceed. He'd taken up enough of their time with his questions. They had a lot more to discuss. "With regard to the ground operations, we've surprised the American Army and grabbed a lot of land quickly," Mackenzie explained, in a voice that was not as optimistic as the news he was sharing. "While we suspected we could grab territory fast, they're getting themselves organized to respond, and now they're starting to get proper air support. What I'm trying to say is, they're going to start pushing us back soon if something doesn't change. What we need is a greater popular uprising to take place in the major cities in your country. We need the people to rise up and take up arms against the government, and in particular, we need them to start attacking the military. If they can attack supply convoys, fuel and ammo dumps, or even military bases, it'll force powers to divert troops to deal with them that otherwise would have been sent against us." Admiral Hill interjected. "We had hoped more ground units would cross over to our side than what did. I had believed we could get some of the Air Force units to side with us and help us out, but sadly that has not been the case. As to a popular uprising, Mackenzie, yes, I agree that we need to stoke those fires and try to get that to happen, but the attack you launched on Washington, D.C. really hurt our chances of getting a plurality of the country to support us. Then, there are those yahoos who went and gruesomely murdered several high-profile conservatives and their families in California. Those two attacks had the opposite effect of what their intentions were. Instead of rallying to our side, people have become appalled by the violence and are now seeing us as the aggressors. They're siding with the vice president in this conflict because you took things too far." Admiral Hill was clearly frustrated and disheartened at how things were turning out. Page shot back. "It's not that bad, Admiral. We just need to start organizing more people in the major cities to join our cause, especially in California, New York, and Illinois. We have to give them targets to take their rage out on and get them organized into effective militia units." Admiral Hill held a hand up. "I agree, Page, and we're doing that, but you have to have some patience. This new war is only a week old. It's going to take a few weeks to get things organized. Plus, it's freaking winter. It's hard to hold massive rallies, marches, and demonstrations when it's below 30 degrees out." Marshall shook his head in dismay. "This would have been a much easier task in any other season," he said rather glumly. "Agreed. But we don't get to choose when these conflicts happen," replied General Mackenzie. "We just have to adapt to the situation and make it work to our advantage. Speaking of advantages, I'd like to go over the results of the Chinese missile attack in the Gulf of Mexico." Marshall nodded, happy for any shred of good news. He signaled for the general to continue. "Several years ago, the People's Liberation Army Navy converted a number of their large freighters into floating missile platforms. They're calling them Long Chi-Wei, which translates to Dragon's Breath ships. They haven't told us how many of them they have, but we know of at least 9. 7 have been sunk by the U.S. Navy, but there are still another 2 left that we know of, and they made a beeline to Cuba. The Russians, for their part, have built up a plethora of SAM sites all over Cuba, in addition to boxing in the Marines at Guantanamo Bay. Mackenzie paused for a moment. He had a concerned look on his face, like he had some bad news but didn't know how to say it. Sensing his hesitation, Admiral Hill pounced. "What is it, Guy? Spit it out." Sighing, Mackenzie announced, "I think we have a problem with the Chinese. As much as they've helped us out by attacking the Navy and Air Force bases with their merchant raiders, their ground army in Mexico still hasn't started their offensive. Each day they delay gives the Pentagon more time to get forces moved over there to deal with them. They should have started their offensive 2 days ago. I'm concerned they may be getting cold feet after that daytime raid on Beijing at the start of the war." Standing up, Marshall indicated that the others should stay seated. He turned his back on them and walked over to look out the window for a second, trying to think about what he wanted to ask next. Outside, he could still see the charred remains of the Ministry of Defense building and a few other smoldering ruins from previous air attacks. The war scars marred the beautiful city that had so graciously allowed him to set up his government in exile. He felt terrible about all the suffering the war was causing the people of Canada. They didn't deserve this, to be caught in the crossfire of an American Civil War. Turning to look at his staff sitting around the large table next to the kitchen, Marshall asked, "If the Chinese fail to launch their invasion of the Southwest, how badly does that complicate things for us?" Leaning forward to answer the question, Admiral Hill explained, "It would be the end of our efforts. We need the Chinese to open that second front so it diverts reinforcements that would be sent against our northern front to the south instead. If that doesn't happen, then Powers will be able to move those divisions he's deployed to Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona to face our forces in the Midwest and Northeast. They'll also be able to suppress the uprising that's happening in California and Oregon with the Marines. We need that uprising to be successful. It could generate thousands of new militia members to help us defeat the Marines and give us a few states where we could freely operate." Marshall nodded. "Then let's hope that doesn't happen," he said. "Let's try to reach out to the Chinese foreign minister and remind him of our deal. If China wants access to America's West Coast ports and a guaranteed source of oil and natural gas from my administration, they'd better hold up their end of the agreement." Washington, D.C., State Department. Secretary Haley Cagle stared at the Indian ambassador for a full 30 seconds as she tried to discern what he was thinking. His face had remained stoic, devoid of emotion, although she was sure his mind must have been working overtime, running through the calculations and second and third-order effects of the offer she'd just presented. After what felt like an eternity for Secretary Cagle, Ambassador Singh crinkled his forehead, breaking his flat expression. "To clarify what you're asking, Acting President Powers wants China to believe that we are going to invade and seize control of Tibet and position our forces to appear that we may push deeper into China if they invade America?" Smiling, she nodded. "Yes." Singh leaned back in his chair and thought about it for a moment. Asif Singh had been the ambassador to the U.S. now for 5 years. He had gotten on well with President Jonathan Sachs, and it was well known that he had been deeply saddened to learn that Sachs had most likely died at the outset of this terrible war. Indian and American relations had grown strong these last 4 years. The U.S. had increased its purchasing on specific Indian products, and India had reciprocated. Both nations were doing well as they sought to right the economic world that China had been exploiting for their gain for so many years. Secretary Cagle realized that despite all this positive will between their two nations, the offer she had presented was a huge risk. Ambassador Singh might not even be able to get his country to go for it. However, the reward, if it were to work, was certainly something she felt must be very tempting. Leaning forward in his chair, Singh looked Secretary Cagle in the eyes. "And in exchange for this military action?" Cagle corrected him. "Perceived military action. It may not have to happen if they back down." Smiling, Singh cleared his throat. "Yes, in exchange for this perceived military action, and follow through if it does have to happen, America will pay off India's national debt and will secure a 10-year firm fixed price on natural gas. If prices go down, we pay less. If they go up, our price is already fixed and will stay that way for the next 10 years? Secretary Cagle nodded. "That is the deal." She saw him hesitate for a moment, so she added, "Ambassador Singh, we both know China is a problem. They are only going to become a worse problem if they aren't dealt with now. If the U.S. is torn apart, if we are broken into fragments, which is what's going to happen if the Chinese invade through Mexico, it may be the end of my country. While I'm sure many in the world will cheer at that, let's not forget the progress our two nations have made together. Let's also not overlook the position India will be in if you have to face China alone. I'm not saying you should follow through with the military action, but if India did, you wouldn't find China in a weaker position than they are right now." "My concern, Madam Secretary, is that I don't believe you or your government fully appreciates the level of casualties or losses the Chinese are willing to sustain if they believe victory can be achieved," Ambassador Singh stated. "Even if we did carry out our attack, the PLA still has all the units in the Western and Southern commands they can draw from to fight us with. The force they sent to Mexico came from the Central and Northern Army groups. That means they still have more than 1 million soldiers in the 2 military districts near us. It would be a bloody fight if we came to blows." "Mr. Ambassador, how much worse would that fight be if those forces weren't in Mexico?" asked Cagle. "How much graver will that conflict be when those forces return home, battle-hardened and flush with victory? You won't have America to rely on or help you." Ambassador Singh grimaced. "I get it, Madam Secretary. America is in a bind. You guys are in a tough spot. We know that. I'm just not sure it will help if we get involved at the moment. Even excluding the Chinese threat of invasion, your country is being torn apart from the inside out. How do we know your nation won't split apart even if the Chinese don't invade?" She bit her lower lip as she tried to formulate a proper response. "I agree, Ambassador. Our country is in the process of fracturing. However, the UN's attack on Washington, the murder of 200 legislators, and the probable death of President Sachs have also coalesced our people around the Vice President like no one could have imagined. Our country has some serious political divides, but at the end of the day, we're still Americans. People are horrified by what's happening. The politically motivated killings, the occupation of several major cities by foreign troops, all of this has stirred the patriotic passions that run deep in our country. The Vice President has just announced a military draft, and even now, our military is in the process of tripling in size. We're going to get through this tough spot, and when we do, Mr. Ambassador, we're going to emerge stronger and better than ever before. Or you may emerge incredibly weakened and unable to be of much help to the rest of the world," the ambassador offered as a counterpoint. Cagle chuckled. "Maybe, but I doubt it. When our domestic troubles have been sorted out, Mr. Ambassador, You can bet your job that we're going to be coming for our pound of flesh against those nations who attacked and occupied our country. We've already delivered a powerful message to the governments of Europe. Don't think our attack was a one-off event. If they continue to invade and occupy our country, we're going to rain death and destruction on their cities like they haven't seen since the last Great War." She paused for a second, letting her last comment hang there for a moment with a wicked grin on her face. Sensing that he was still wavering, she leaned in to add, "One more thing, Mr. Ambassador. What I'm about to tell you must stay strictly confidential. You may share this with the key members of your government, but otherwise this needs to stay quiet." She stopped long enough for him to acknowledge what she said before she proceeded. It was Chinese H-20 stealth bombers that carried out the attack that may have claimed the life of our president and killed our Secretary of Defense and many of our senior military leaders at Raven Rock. If those bombers could penetrate our airspace, they will change the dynamics of a future war between India and China. She paused for a second while he digested that piece of intelligence. The bombs that hit the facility the President and our Secretary of Defense were in were Russian-made thermobaric weapons, but it was the Chinese bombers that delivered them. As such, we've warned the Chinese that if they do invade our country, we will respond with tactical nuclear weapons. Singh raised an eyebrow at that, but didn't say anything right away. "You would use tactical nuclear weapons on your own soil?" he asked skeptically. She slowly shook her head. "No, not on our soil. In China." "What? Where?" he stammered in response. "In Three Gorges Dam," she replied nonchalantly. "We've already told them that we'd hit the dam and destroy the economy of an entire region if they attempt to invade our country." Singh looked almost sick at the thought. He opened his mouth, then closed it as he thought about his response. "You realize such an attack could kill tens of millions of people, right? The political cost of such an attack globally would be worse than what you're already having to deal with from your attacks on Paris, Berlin, Moscow, and Beijing," he said, his voice crescendoed as he spoke. Slamming her hand on the table and startling Singh, Cagle spoke through gritted teeth. "Those bastards got caught red-handed rigging our election. Then they bombed our capital. They killed hundreds of our legislators and then assassinated our president. French and German soldiers just captured New York City last night." She spoke with vitriol and venom dripping from her voice. Cagle then leaned forward, closing the personal space between them. "If I were the president, I'd have already nuked those countries back to the Stone Age. As it is, acting President Powers is showing far more restraint than I or our military believe he should." She paused, and then sat back in her chair, noticing how visibly uncomfortable Singh had become. "Ambassador Singh, destroying the Three Gorges Dam achieves a number of military and political objectives. The hydroelectric power produced there accounts for 10% of China's entire electrical output. It provides 56% of the electrical power to the province of Hubei, as well as 30% of Zhejiang province's power, and 24% of Shanghai's. The loss of this much electrical generation at one time, along with the inordinate amount of infrastructure damage to the region, will force the Chinese to reevaluate whether they are willing to pay that high of a price to continue with their invasion. We have demanded that they withdraw and go home. However, if they choose to still invade, then we'll hit their army with tactical nukes on our own soil if necessary. But one way or another, we will stop them." Singh clearly wasn't quite sure how to respond to what he'd just heard. Seeing the pained look and uncertainty on his face, Cagle quickly added, "Our goal is not to do this horrible thing, Ambassador Singh, but make no mistake, our country has been savagely attacked and invaded. We will use any and all means necessary to win. If we're going to go through an internal civil war, then we'll handle that internally. But we won't allow outside forces to shape our country or its future by supporting one side over another. Right now, we're hoping that if India makes a serious threat of intervening in Tibet, it will give the Chinese pause. If they do invade, then we don't have much choice, other than to make the price of invading America too steep for even them to pay." Singh reached for his glass of water, his hand shaking slightly. "When do you need an answer by?" he asked. "We need to know as soon as possible, Mr. Ambassador. This isn't a decision that we can wait to hear from you about in a week or two. The Chinese could launch their invasion any time. If they do, we'll be forced to hit that dam." "I'll bet the Chinese Air Force is doing everything they can to make sure you aren't successful now that they know you intend to blow it up," Ambassador Singh countered. She smiled and nodded. "They are. Our satellites show a massive increase in defensive measures being set up around the dam. In the end, though, it won't matter. They know they can't stop us, and the B-2 stealth bomber isn't the only way we have of delivering our response to their invasion. If they do decide to cross that Rubicon, I can assure you, China won't survive." Grimacing at the ominous statement, Ambassador Singh responded, "I just hope the rest of the world will survive whatever may come next." This has been Peacekeepers, the Falling Empires series, Book 2. Written by James Rosone and Miranda Watson. Narrated by B.J. Harrison. Copyright 2019 by Frontline Publishing. Production copyright 2020 by Frontline Publishing.
Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss another video.
In the meantime, we have plenty of reading material to keep you busy. You can find it all on our website, frontlinepublishinginc.com.